In May of 2023, Red Hook Studios released Darkest Dungeon 2, and with its arduous explorations, grueling battles, and unforgiving boss fights, it furthered the reputation of ruthlessness set by its predecessor. Just like with the first game, the main gameplay loop of Darkest Dungeon 2 involves gathering a group of heroes to fight through brigands, cultists, and monsters. But unlike the first game, these horrors aren't contained to a rural hamlet somewhere off in the countryside. They're spread over an entire kingdom, emerging at the same time that an evil darkness began to encroach on the kingdom. And unless this darkness is stopped, it threatens to plunge the rest of the world into the same chaos that engulfs the kingdom. These huge stakes are still part of a personal journey though, as throughout their quest, the player learns from an old colleague named the Academic that they've had a hand in the spread of this terrible darkness, and that ultimately, they're the only hope the world has in stopping it. Let's go through the story of the Academic and his protege, along with their path to redemption, to see the full story of Darkest Dungeon 2. Before we begin, I just want to say that obviously there's going to be spoilers for the story of Darkest Dungeon 2 ahead, so if you want to experience the eldritch horrors of the game yourself, now's the time to click away to do so. Also, if you'd like a refresher on the story of the first game, or would like to learn what it's about for the first time, I do have a video for the game, along with all its story DLC, up on the channel that you can watch if you'd like. I will say that it's not really necessary to be familiar with the story of the first game to enjoy the story of the second, as the two aren't really linked. There will be some Easter eggs and allusions to the first game that you won't understand if you aren't familiar with it, but that's really all you'll miss out on. So you're fine to skip the video if you'd like. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's get started. The story starts in an unnamed medieval kingdom that was very much like other kingdoms of its time. It had lush farmlands where crops were grown for the populace. It had docks and harbors along its coast that were filled with fishermen and merchants busy with the demands of trade and shipping. And it had sprawling cities of stone that served as beacons of progress and industry. All of these regions were connected together by a vast roadway that was not only essential for the citizens of the kingdom, but for merchants and traders from far-off lands as well, who were eager to come to the prosperous kingdom to trade goods of their own. As these travelers made their way through the realm, they could stop at the various inns and taverns that were all over the highway, where their carriages could be repaired, their supplies could be replenished, and their spirits could be lifted. While there was corruption and crime in the kingdom, as there is in any civilization, for the most part, the citizens of the realm lived ordinary, happy lives. However, the kingdom was not wholly picturesque, as there was one region that inspired fear and horror in travelers and natives alike: the towering mountain that loomed large on one of its borders. With its foreboding rocky peaks, it had a sinister look, and an ill reputation to match. There were whispers that it was the home of some kind of intense evil energy. Most of the populace was never eager to find out if there was any truth to these rumors, preferring to leave the dark mists of the mountain unexplored. However, there were some people that were fascinated by the dark wonder of these stories and sought out the truth, making their way to the treacherous slopes. These curious minds became the only residents of the mountain, forming a dark cult that was said to practice sacrilegious rituals too evil to fathom. But not every person that was fascinated with the horrific tales of the world was reckless enough to run to the mountain. Plenty of these people were quite ordinary, leading normal lives in the confines of the kingdom. One such person was a man that was known as the Academic. As suggested by his name, the Academic was a scholar, and when he wasn't plunging the depths of the world to find their forbidden secrets, he worked as a teacher in one of the universities that stood in the kingdom's cities, where he guided the bright, youthful minds of the realm. One semester, as he was giving his normal lectures, the Academic took notice of one particular student due to the interesting questions the student asked him on all his favorite subjects. It wasn't long before the Academic deduced that it was because this student shared his fascination with the taboo subjects of the world, and as a result, the Academic took the student as his protege, serving as a mentor to him. As the two spent more time together, discussing their theories on long walks through the land or sneaking away from school events to debate the topics of their research, the student-mentor relationship between them quickly turned into a partnership and then a full-blown friendship. Their research into the occult led them to conduct a variety of experiments, like one that involved dissecting the brain of a cadaver to understand the properties of the mind, or another that produced a tentacled, fleshy creature that needed to be caged, as well as the discovery of several artifacts or relics that had strange powers, like a polyhedral object recovered from a sunken temple, or an altar glowing with a red orb that seemed to have some sort of connection to the void. While their findings were amazing, none of them unlocked the secrets of the world that they so sought. So the two turned their attention to the myths and legends of ancient cultures, noticing a pattern that ran through the stories. Eventually, after many long months of research, the protege found what they were looking for. Scribbled in blood in the margin of an old book, he found a cipher that mentioned an interesting symbol, a half circle with 5 equidistant points radiating from its edge, an iron crown. And as the two reviewed their previous notes, they found that this iron crown was seen in many different cultures across many different time periods all over the world, suggesting that whatever the symbol was, it bestowed immense power upon the one that harnessed it, leading to the creation of several empires throughout history. To say the protege was excited about this discovery would be an understatement, and he was eager to share their findings with the world. But the academic was more wary, preaching caution so that they could have a strong case to present to their peers, and so their research wasn't stolen before they could fully gather the details. The protege agreed, but wasn't happy about it. As the months wore on, he voiced his displeasure, but each time he was dissuaded by the academic, who didn't want his career, nor the protege's future, to be ruined by a premature presentation. Then, tragedy struck. A fire broke out in the university, and all the research done by the academic and the protege got caught up in the flames, burning away into ash, leaving them with nothing. It was a heart-wrenching turn of events. Yet, at the same time, the academic couldn't help but feel relieved at being freed from researching the Iron Crown, as he had felt a resentment growing in his friend at his insistence that they be cautious with their work. Perhaps now things could go back to how they were. But then an interesting letter arrived on their doorstep. It had been mailed by a wealthy nobleman who lived in a rural hamlet off in the countryside of the kingdom. Apparently, this nobleman had heard of the work the two had done and invited them to dinner at his farmhouse so they could discuss their research further. After a day-long journey through the countryside, the academic and the protege arrived to find that they were not the only guests of the nobleman. There were others as well, although they were all hooded and masked. As the dinner got underway, the hooded figures began to question the academic and the protege about their research. Although the nobleman assured the two that the questions were only for academic purposes, due to the prevalence of the Iron Crown and the iconography that surrounded them, as well as the fervor of the masked figures and their host, the academic sensed an ulterior motive behind the gathering. When a circle was drawn on the floor with chalk and salt, and black flame candles were lit, and chants in extinct languages began, the academic noted the turn from research to ritual. Wisely, he excused himself and pulled the protege with him, who, having been caught up in all the excitement, hadn't realized just how precarious of a situation they were in. Once he had been separated from the passion of the cultists, he recognized the wisdom of the academic's words and agreed to block the door to the bedroom. When the sun rose the next morning, the two emerged from their sanctuary, where they found the hooded figures strangled and lying upon the circle, their bodies making up the points of the Iron Crown, which lay inert under them. The nobleman was nowhere to be seen. While the academic was disgusted by the scene, thankful that he and the protege had not participated in the failed ritual and had escaped such a grisly end, the protege was mesmerized. From that point on, he became obsessed with perfecting this ritual to the point where it became the sole focus of his entire existence. When the next fall semester started, the protege didn't enroll in any classes at the university, instead taking up residence in an isolated building where he could conduct his work free from the restraints, moral and otherwise, that those at the university would impose on him. He was joined by the academic, who went with him not as a mentor, but as an assistant, helping with the various experiments the protege carried out to unlock the secrets of the Iron Crown, such as ones centered on light, which burned their eyes, or others centered on sound, which caused their ears to bleed. As more and more of these tests were conducted, the academic could see the effect they were having on his friend. It was driving him mad, which only deepened the reluctance to proceed that had been growing in the academic's heart. Finally, he could stand it no longer and confronted the protege one morning, begging him to stop his experiments and see reason. But the protege, caught up in his obsession and ambition, refused, throwing their breakfast to the floor in a violent outburst. And there, in that moment, the academic recognized all that the Iron Crown had taken from the two of them. Their careers, their futures, and most important of all, their friendship. And it was still trying to take more. He refused to let it do so any longer. He got ready to leave, asking one last time for the protege to come with him. But the protege wouldn't be dissuaded, and instead convinced the academic to look at one last thing before he went. The two made their way down to the cellar, where the academic was shocked to see 4 bodies lying in a semicircle on an unfinished Iron Crown. As he realized why he had been brought to see this macabre sight, a dagger burst through his chest. He crumpled to the ground, lifeless, and his body took its place on the last point of the crown. By sacrificing his closest friend and giving himself wholly over to the Iron Crown, the protege succeeded where the hooded figures and noblemen had failed. He successfully harnessed the power of the Iron Crown. Once it took its place upon his brow, the equation of the world, of the universe, of the whole of reality laid bare before him, the sum of his work. But as he was appreciating his accomplishments, the equation started to change before his eyes. He had no way of knowing, but in addition to allowing one to see the ephemeral equation, the Iron Crown allowed the thoughts and feelings of the one that invoked its power to manipulate it. When the protege placed the crown on his head, his thoughts and feelings began to do just this. But what poured from his mind was all of the hate and resentment and frustration that had been building in him ever since he learned of the crown. And the changes these feelings had on the equation had an ill effect on the kingdom and the real world. The earth itself quaking at the power, the crown caused monstrous transformations in humanity, all influenced by the protege's flaws. Chief among them being the cultists of the mountain, who took on a fleshy, tentacled appearance. The crown wasn't just changing what already existed though, it was also creating anew, bringing into existence entities never before seen in the universe, unspeakable horrors imprinted with the protege's insatiable, ambitious hunger. It also created powerful monsters that were the physical embodiments of the protege's failings. His denial became a series of chains and padlocks that locked away the world's mind. His resentment became the seething sigh, a monster that freely let loose all the anger he'd held in his chest. His obsession birthed the focused fault, which, once it concentrated on a subject, bore into it with a power unrivaled by anything else in the world. And his ambition manifested into the ravenous Reach, a monster that symbolized how the protege clawed after his desires, but was never satisfied with what he had nor what he had to give up to reach them. The finest of these creations, though, was a gargantuan, monstrous titan with squirming guts and a single giant eye, his full body of work. And atop the head of this titan sat a facsimile of the protege, a dark copy of the King of the Iron Crown. It was an incredible display, but despite it being the culmination of his work, of all his sacrifices and determination, the protege was horrified by it, recognizing how deplorable and wrong it all was. Being the King of the Iron Crown, he had the ability to use it to correct his mistake, to right the wrong. But the evil effects of the dark parts of his mind broke his willpower. He fled from the darkness he'd unleashed upon the world, running away to a remote valley deep in the kingdom, where he intended to hide from the darkness for the rest of his life. Without the protege to stop it, the darkness soon spread over the kingdom, primarily emanating from the focal point of evil in the realm, the ominous mountain, where the evil twin of the protege resided as the hateful god of the stain spreading over the world. From this dark domain, the cultists poured forth, eager to spread the corruption of their master out into the wider world. The kingdom had sensed this invasion was coming and sent their army, led by its general, to the woods at the mountain's base to stop the cultists. But when the cultists descended from the mountain slopes, the soldiers offered no resistance, having already been demoralized by the horror of the power coming from the mountain. Instead, they simply wandered the woods, listless and empty. As time wore on, their bodies began to decay until they were nothing more than shriveled up cadavers. But still, the soldiers wandered on, dreaming of the day that the end of the world gave them the release that had been denied to them. The general too suffered this fate, but instead of wandering, he had his dreams on a bed of branches in the fortress that used to be his command post, where he had endless nightmares about the failures, real and imagined, of his life. The forest, having now decayed into a tangled, gnarled mass of roots and branches filled with undead, grew around and through the sleeping general, as well as the remnants of his men, a physical representation that they would never be free of its dark clutches. With the army having failed, the cultists freely ravaged the kingdom, plunging it into chaos. Rabid animals that could usually be culled by the guard ran amok, attacking anyone unfortunate enough to cross their path and building large dens where they grew stronger and more numerous. Brigands and bandits took advantage of the chaos to pillage the towns and villages of the realm, all in pursuit of separating the people from their riches so they could take it for themselves. In the sprawling cities, massive riots broke out. It wasn't long before fires were set by the mob, and as the flames roared through the buildings, all the accumulated knowledge of humanity burned with the structures. However, instead of lamenting this lost knowledge, the mob celebrated it, having become enthralled by the fires. Even the librarian of the great library couldn't help but be seduced by the allure of the flames. The mob began to worship them, and even began to throw themselves into them. But as the heat seared their bodies, melting their skin and fat, it did not consume them. Instead, they became resistant to the fires and even gained the ability to control them to an extent, to use them for their benefit. These blessings only cemented their warped belief system, leading them to become fanatics of the fire. These crazed lunatics turned murderous and used their newfound powers to kill all those that did not adhere to their beliefs, adorning the streets of the cities and their own bodies with the corpses and limbs of their victims. Out in the rural farmlands of the kingdom, the farmers and the noble families that managed them watched as the realm descended into chaos around them. Figuring there was no need to prepare for tomorrow, they gave in to their impulses and engorged themselves on all the food they'd grown and stored away for the winter. But once their storehouses were emptied, they found they were still hungry. So the populace turned to their next best food source, the beasts of burden on their farms. However, the only thing left of the animals were their rotting corpses, a result of the animals having starved to death after all of their food had been eaten by their owners. The decaying carrion didn't stop the farmers and nobles though, who, no longer wanting to feel the pangs of hunger, ate what they could of the remains, but found they were still hungry. Desperate to sate the intense hunger that ached their bellies, the people of the farmlands turned on themselves, cannibalizing each other to end their torturous starvation. But they were still hungry. As they devolved into this frenzy of consumption, where they ate any and everything they could to stave off their starvation, their once luscious fields were transformed into an area filled with rot, where spoiled meat and flesh lay all over. And then something strange happened. A new crop sprouted in the fields, tall stalks that resembled the piles of rancid meat that covered the area. The farmers and nobles, no longer having inhibitions about eating things they probably shouldn't, soon ate this plant and were thrilled to find that it satisfied their hunger. Thus, they gobbled up any trace of this crop they could find, feasting in the fields. And as they gave in to their deranged gluttony, their bodies began to undergo monstrous transformations. Rows upon rows of sharp teeth filled their mouths, and their jaws grew wider and wider, giving them new maws that allowed them to consume as much as possible. A transformation that also gave them a new name, the gluttonous plague eaters. Like the fanatics, these plague eaters began a worship of their own, but their worship wasn't directed towards an inanimate object like fire. It was a plague eater of their own, a large baby that was birthed by a corpulent mother while she was in the midst of being eaten by the monsters. Unlike all the other plague eaters, the baby hadn't adopted the crop, it was born from it, having been a plague eater since it was in its mother's womb, thus making it a child of the rotten harvest. To honor it, it was adorned with a wreath, put in a cornucopia, a traditional symbol of the harvest, and placed in the largest manor of the farmlands, where it was revered as the flower of the plague eaters. Having seen what happened in the forests, cities, and farmlands of the kingdom, the fishermen and merchants on the coasts realized the apocalypse was nigh. Having no idea what else to do, they began to pray to the sea, and when huge stone monoliths rocketed up from the ocean's depths, the people believed it was an answer to their prayers. They threw themselves before the monoliths, begging for deliverance, promising to give themselves over to whatever entity sent these structures. And with that promise, they were given the path to their salvation. They descended into the waters of the ocean, where a huge sea monster named the Leviathan remade their bodies in its image, making them one of the fish folk. The transformation signified not only a physical acceptance of their new life, but a spiritual one as well, as by giving their souls over to the Leviathan and worshiping it as a god, they truly became one of its people. After being transformed, the people of the coast returned to their former homes to pillage and gather tribute for their god, thus rendering the docks and harbors that once bustled with life empty and desolate, where one always wondered what horrors hid behind the shroud of mist that covered the whole area. With the whole kingdom in chaos, the desperate few that were not killed in the devastation fled, and as they made their way across the country, they noticed newly opened holes in the ground. These holes led to long disused waterways that seemed like they could offer safety from the chaos of the surface, but in truth were the home of bestial creatures that were just as horrific as the monsters and lunatics above. Grotesque, unnatural pig-man hybrids that freely frolicked in the filth of these long-abandoned tunnels. While the kingdom had received reports of these creatures from a rural hamlet in the east of the kingdom, reports that suggested the swine creatures also had an otherworldly intelligence about them, they never investigated them. As such, the pigmen had been able to multiply and spread in the darkness of the Warrens undisturbed for years. While the pigmen were used to the dark of the tunnels, any surface dweller that was unfortunate enough to find themselves in the home of the pigmen would quickly become lost in the winding tunnels. And unless they made a quick exit, they were doomed to become a meal for the swine creatures, who delighted in getting some fresh meat to fill their bellies with. Wholly gripped in all these unearthly horrors, the kingdom seemed destined to fall. And with how unstoppable the evil power emanating from the mountain was, it seemed likely that the rest of the world would inevitably follow suit. Although there was one person that had the power to stop this outcome, he didn't have the willpower, still cowering in his lonesome cottage in the valley, refusing to face his sins. The situation seemed hopeless. That is, until the protege received an unexpected visitor that changed everything. Despite his cowardice, the protege did feel guilty about the darkness he had brought into the world, and as it fell to ruin around him, this guilt continued to grow and grow until one night, while he was sitting alone in his cottage, something burst through his door. It was an apparition of his old friend, the academic, a manifestation of all the guilt that had built up in the protege's heart. Having decided enough was enough, the academic charged the protege with going out into the world to fight back against the darkness, thereby righting his wrongs and redeeming himself. As a last bit of motivation, the academic gave the protege something that he and the rest of the world needed: a small flame that made up the last bit of hope left in the world. Although its light was dim now, it was enough to encourage the protege to take up the charge. He climbed aboard his carriage and set out to face his sins and save the world. The protege's destination was the source of where all the evil covering the land was emanating from, the ominous mountain. But the mountain was leagues away, across the whole of the kingdom, which, of course, meant the protege would have to fight his way through the mayhem that reigned in the realm to reach it. That posed a problem, as the protege, like their mentor, was a scholar, not a fighter. Luckily, he found a solution to his dilemma at a crossroads not far from his cottage. Like the other locations in the kingdom, this crossroads was calling things from the reaches of the world to gather here. But it was not calling for lunatics or monsters. It was calling for people that were searching for redemption of their own. And all those that arrived were capable fighters. The protege was able to enlist these mercenaries to his cause, convincing them that by helping him, they too could find the redemption they so sought. With a party gathered, the group set out into the devastated regions of the kingdom, clearing out the creature dens and fighting through the monsters and cultists, collecting trinkets and items to assist them in battle, and helping the desperate few that had not yet been killed in the chaos as they did so. At times, the forces of darkness proved too much for the group, so the protege would pull them back to the valley to regroup and rest. Or if he let his overconfidence get the better of him, he would retreat on his own, having watched the mercenaries fall in battle. In either case, the protege did not return empty-handed. He brought with him small candles of hope that he and his adventuring party had found in their expedition. These candles were an integral part to the protege's journey, as they could be used at an altar of hope not far from his cottage to stoke the flame of hope, allowing it to grow in brightness and power. As the flame grew, it pushed back against the darkness of the Iron Crown, allowing the protege to remember what the world was like before its ruin, giving hope that it could one day be restored to that state. With the recognition that their work was not in vain, the protege and the mercenaries went on further expeditions through the kingdom, further cultivating the hope of the realm by extinguishing the fires of the fanatics and the librarian, ending the dreams of the sleeping general and his men, cleansing the fetter of the plague eaters and the harvest child, toppling the marine god of the shroud, and culling the swine creatures of the sluice. However, while these actions helped push the darkness back, they did not quell it, as the Iron Crown continued to interact with the Protégé's mind to bring back the evil that was destroyed by his expeditions. In order to fully defeat the darkness, the Protégé needed to face his failures. Failures that were made manifest and resided at the mountain. With the help of the ever-growing hope of the flame, as well as the encouragement of the Protégé's mentor, whose voice had been ringing in his head through his whole journey, the Protégé and his group of mercenaries made several journeys to the mountain and defeated the physical embodiment of the Protégé's failures. They overcame the powers of negation of the shackles of denial and destroyed them, thereby freeing the world's mind. They weathered the sharp breath of the seething sigh until they killed the Avatar, allowing the Protégé to release his resentment and breathe easy again. They withstood the gaze of the focused fault until they eliminated the monster, which opened the Protégé's eyes, letting him get over his obsessions and see his other blessings and accomplishments. And they defeated each form of the ravenous reach to reel in the Protégé's dark ambition, making him realize its rewards were not worth the damage it caused. With the defeat of these monstrosities, there was only one left to overcome: the manifestation of the Protégé's cowardice, his body of work, and the hateful god that sat atop the Titan. When he and his final group finally made it to the mountain to face the sum total of his failings, due to the size of the work, it had to be attacked in stages, starting with the squirming guts of its torso. Once its venomous bile had been withstood, the party faced the large eye on the Titan's chest. Although fierce, the power of its gaze was nothing like the focused fault, and soon the eye was forced shut, bringing the party face to face with the hateful god of the mountain. The god used the full extent of his powers in the battle, using dark spells to damage the mercenaries, as well as to call evil creatures of its making to assist it. Despite the futility of attempting to topple this power, the mercenaries and the Protégé refused to give up, encouraged by the bright flame of hope that burned alongside them. Then, the hateful god got an idea. He cast a spell that conjured up the ghosts from the pasts of the mercenaries to haunt them and destroy their morale. But what the evil twin of the Protégé thought would be a boon for him turned out to be the start of his downfall, as once the summoned specter was destroyed by the mercenary it came from, they were emboldened, giving them a fierce power that struck a deep wound to the Dark Lord. These exaltations turned the tide of the battle, and eventually, the hateful god was destroyed by the Protégé and the mercenaries, thereby ending his scourge of evil and saving the kingdom. The god did not go alone, however, as his death brought about the death of the Protégé as well. But before life left him completely, the Protégé, with his failings overcome, regained full control of the Iron Crown and used his memory of what the kingdom used to be to remake and rebuild it, rebalancing the equation of the world and absolving him of his sins. As the sun rises on a kingdom rebuilt, a symbol of the resilience and determination of the human spirit, the story of Darkest Dungeon 2 comes to an end. At first glance, Darkest Dungeon 2 appears to be a deeply negative experience, with grueling, unforgiving battles and boss fights, and a main character that literally causes the downfall of the world you play in. But the game throws all this negativity at you to hammer home its major themes, which are actually positive and inspiring. The reward of persevering through hardships and difficulty until you overcome them. The strength given by hope in the face of insurmountable odds. And most prevalent of all, the healing power of redemption, which can transform something as small as a person to something as big as the entire world. Although it is true that all of us have a darkest dungeon of our own inside of us, if we take the lessons we learned in playing through Darkest Dungeon 2 we can overcome that darkness and live a life of hope and happiness. Now, I'm not perfect, so there may be some errors in the telling of this story. For instance, I think you could make an argument that all the craziness happened in the kingdom before the protege fled, but for the most part, this should tell the main story of Darkest Dungeon 2 in full. At least for now. If the second game is anything like the first, we may eventually get additional content down the line that will flesh out the story even more. If that's the case, I can't wait to see what kind of things Red Hook has up their sleeves. But we'll just have to be patient and wait for that time to come. In the meantime, if you have any questions or anything on the story of the second game, or even the first, feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer them. Before I go, I'd like to remind you that every episode is uploaded to Spotify, so feel free to listen over there if that's easier for you. Alright, that's it for this one, so thank you for watching, and see you later.